Santa Brigida is a suburb on the southern extremity of this city. Actually, it is an ancient Indian-Spanish village, linked by petrol stations and factories to the metropolis. The houses are sometimes of adobe and sometimes of massive stone. The streets are roughly paved and narrow, bordered with trees and high walls hiding colonial mansions and parks. The place would have a certain charm if it did not smell so strongly on wet days of the paper factory, Gomez and Company. A drop of rain and the whole place is invaded by a frightful stink. The last house on Cala Abahaca was the institution. It was quite unlike anything that either Carmella or I had imagined. There were walls, naturally, but otherwise everything was different. Outside nothing much could be seen except great old walls, over which dripped plumbago and ivory. The front door was a massive lump of wood studded with iron lumps that might once have been heads. They were rubbed almost smooth. I could just see a tower jutting about a story over the wall. All this looked more like a medieval castle than the hospital or prison I had expected. The lady who let us in was so surprisingly different from the immaculate keeper I had expected that I could not stop looking at her. She was somewhat younger than myself, about 10 years, say. She wore a pair of flannel pyjama trousers, a gentleman's dinner jacket and a grey turtleneck sweater. She had rather a lot of hair which straggled out from under a yachting cap which bore the words HMS Thumbelina and a crown. She seemed very excited and never stopped talking. Galahad and Muriel tried to make a remark now and then, and she did not let them get a word in edgeways. First impressions are never very clear. I can only say there seemed to be several courtyards, cloisters, stagnant fountains, trees, shrubs, lawns. The main building was in fact a castle, surrounded by various pavilions with incongruous shapes. Pixie-like dwellings shaped like toadstools, Swiss chalets, railway carriages, one or two ordinary bungalows, something shaped like a boot, another like what I took to be an outsized Egyptian mummy. It was also very strange that I for once doubted the accuracy of my observation. Our guide went on talking excitedly and seemed to be explaining something to me. She ignored Muriel and Galahad. I could see astonishment written all over their faces, but the fact that they had taken the trouble to bring my trunk prevented them from changing their minds. After walking for a long time, we got to a tower which was standing alone in a vegetable garden. This was not the tower of the main building. It was a new tower, and not more than 3 stories tall and whitewashed. It had a certain resemblance to a lighthouse, hardly what one would expect in a garden. Our guide opened the door and, after talking for a quarter of an hour, let us in. This extraordinary place was evidently where I was supposed to live. The only real furniture was a wicker chair and a small table. All the rest was painted. What I mean is that the walls were painted with the furniture that wasn't there. It was so clever that I was almost taken in at first. I tried to open the painted wardrobe, a bookcase with books and their titles. An open window with a curtain fluttering in the breeze, or rather it would have fluttered if it were a real curtain. A painted door on a shelf with all sorts of ornaments. All this one-dimensional furniture had a strangely depressing effect, like banging one's nose against a glass door. It was not long before Galahad and Muriel left, but our companion stayed on, talking like mad. I wondered if she knew that I could not hear a word she said. But it would have been impossible to communicate anything through the torrent of words, even if my enunciation had been loud and strong. Finally I left her alone, still talking, and climbed up the stairs to examine the rest of the tower. There was a room with a real window, a bed and a closet. The walls were undecorated. In the corner was a ladder leading to a trap-door which I decided to leave for another occasion, as I felt rather weak from so much exertion. I was able to make 25 trips up and down stairs and unpack my entire trunk, and she was still talking. I decided I might risk using my hearing trumpet. The bathroom was on the ground floor and was a good spot for testing acoustics. Not that it would make a great deal of difference, because he was not allowed to here in any case because of the ducks. He sent me a fine long letter, though, and you should have read how he chased a jackal for 10 kilometres. It is almost tea time now, and Mr. Gambit expects us to be assembled before the bell rings. Dr. Gambit is a highly unreasonable person concerning time, so we had better hurry. Personally, I think that time is unimportant, and when I think of the autumn leaves and the snow, the spring and the summer, the birds and the bees, I realise that time is unimportant, yet people attach so much importance to clocks. Now, I believe in inspiration. An inspired conversation between two people with some mysterious affinity can bring more joy into life than even the most expensive kind of clock. Unfortunately, there are very few inspired people, and one has to fall back on one's own store of vital fire. This is most exhausting, especially, as you know, I have to work day and night, even if all my bones ache and my head is swimming, and I am fainting with fatigue, and nobody understands my mortal fight to keep on my feet, and not to lose my inspired joy of life, even if I do have palpitations of the heart, and they drive me like a poor beast of burden. I often feel like Joan of Arc, so dreadfully misunderstood, and all those terrible cardinals and bishops prodding her poor agonised mind with so much unnecessary questions. I can't help feeling some deep affinity with Joan of Arc, and I often feel I am being burned at the stake just because I am different from everybody else, because I've always refused to give up that wonderful, strange power I have inside me, and it becomes manifested when I am in harmonious communication with some other inspired being like myself. I made several futile attempts to tell her that I heartily agreed with her philosophy of life. I also wanted to ask if I might bring my hearing trumpet into tea without exciting too much commentary, but it was impossible. She went right on talking, although I stood in front of her, opening and shutting my mouth hopefully. I was also beginning to worry about the Dr. Gambit, who disliked people being late for tea, but my companion showed no sign of moving, and she stood blocking the only exit. We might get no tea at all if we did not go immediately. This would be very unpleasant. Supposing they only gave high tea and no supper, I would have to go hungry till breakfast. If only people in this world realised the importance of understanding each other. Now take me, nobody understands me here. They don't even make an effort to take a small share of the terrible burden of work which is crushing me down like Joan of Arc. Yet my source of inspiration is still untouched because of the fighting power inside me. Bubbles of pure creative ideas pouring out of me. I give, yet other people do not share this faculty of understanding. More and more work is poured upon me. When I get up in the mornings, I am overcome with a terrible nausea because I am overworked. Simple overwork is enough to bleed you dry. I am so foolishly generous that other people profit from me all the time, and all the endless tasks of the day and night are heaped on my shoulders. This was most alarming. What sort of terrible toil had deranged the poor woman? Would I also have to work day and night till I couldn't stop talking? Perhaps they made her shovel coal for a huge furnace. Probably they kept a private crematorium. Old people do keep dying off. Maybe they had a chain gang too, and we would have to chop stones and sing sea shanties. This would explain why she wore the yachting cap. All those eccentric huts outside began to take on a sinister meaning. Nursery-rhyme bungalows to trick the old ladies' families into thinking we led a childish and peaceful life, and behind the scenes a huge crematorium and a chain gang. I began to feel ill, and not to mind if we missed tea after all. My arm was paralysed with holding the hearing trumpet, but some kind of unhappy fascination prevented me from taking it away and sinking back into what now seemed like blissful silence. Somewhere in the distance a bell rang, and, still talking, my companion took me by the arm, and we set out towards the main building. I held the trumpet to my ear as if hypnotised. Her talk was like the wheel of fortune that has certain variations, but always gets back to the same point. Her enthusiasm never flagged, nor did her pleasant wrinkled face change its expression of intense sincerity. Later on I learned that my companion's name was Anna Wurtz. She did not tell me this herself, for she would never have had time to communicate anything so practical and banal. The dining hall was a long paralleled room with French windows leading out into the garden. Green velvet curtains, somewhat the worse for wear, separated us from a big lounge in which everything was covered with chintz. We arrived just in time to take our places as everybody sat down. I was placed between Anna Wurtz and another lady. We were sitting in the row with our backs to the French windows, and this gave me a feeling of claustrophobia. For a day or two the 9 personalities of my new companions were somewhat confused. They were all quite different, of course, but it takes time to tell people apart. After a first brief examination, I did not dare look too closely at Dr. Gambit, as I was afraid to appear rude. He sat at the head of the table, which was natural, I suppose, he being the only gentleman present. The first impression he gave was of being bald, almost starkly bald, very plump and nervous. It was difficult to see his eyes, as he wore very thick spectacles. When I did eventually manage to peep behind these thick lenses, I saw he had mild green eyes with dark lashes, rather incongruous in such a face. They looked like the eyes of a child. They were eyes that looked at nothing. I suppose he was so short-sighted that there was nothing much he could see anyhow, poor man. We were no sooner sitting in front of our rations of strawberry jam and 2 slices of bread than Anna Wurtz immediately launched into something that may have been a speech. "Silence, Anna Wurtz, hold your peace," said Dr. Gambit so suddenly and in such a penetrating nasal voice that I dropped my spoon. Even without the trumpet I could hear him perfectly. Today, for the benefit of our new member of our little society, I shall outline the basic principles of Lightsome Hall. Most of you have been here for some time and are thoroughly acquainted with our purpose. We seek to follow the inner meaning of Christianity and comprehend the original teaching of the Master. You have heard me repeating these phrases many, many times, yet do we really grasp the meaning of such work? Work it is, and work it shall remain. Before we begin to get even a faint glimmer of truth, we must strive for many years and lose hope time and time again before the first recompense is awarded us. I noticed that he had a slightly foreign accent which was difficult to place. Nevertheless, his nasal voice was as audible as any siren. He seemed to inspire everybody with great respect. They all chewed their food and looked at their plates with serious faces. While he spoke, I was able to examine a large oil painting on the wall facing me. The painting represented a nun with a very strange and malicious face. "These apparently simple, though infinitely difficult principles are the core of our teaching," went on Dr. Gambit. "There are 2 little words which will ever supply the key to the understanding of inner Christianity. Self-remembering. My friends, are the words which we must strive to keep present through all our daily activities." The face of the nun in the oil painting was so curiously lighted that she seemed to be winking, although this was hardly possible. She must have had one blind eye, and the painter had rendered her infirmity realistically. However, the idea that she was winking persisted. She was winking at me with a most disconcerting mixture of mockery and malevolence. "Self-remembering must not, however," continued the doctor, "make us into dreary fanatics. We can remember ourselves and be excellent and merry companions at the same time." The thought of Dr. Gambit being merry was rather frightening, so I stole a look at Anna Wurtz to dissipate the image. She was staring at her plate, looking absolutely furious. 1 or 2 ladies asked Dr. Gambit questions, and I timidly applied my hearing trumpet so that they could see I was taking an intelligent interest. The first lady who spoke was wearing a rather smart striped blouse and waistcoat and had her hair cropped like a man. Later I found out that she was the French marquise called Claude de Chateaubriand. This impressed me deeply, as I'd only met a few aristocrats during my life. "Should we try to remember ourselves while playing snakes and ladders?" she asked. "We self-remember at all hours and at all occupations or recreations," replied the doctor. I noticed that his spectacles gave a keen glance at my trumpet. A small woman with a worried expression and sparse fluffy hair was the next one to speak. I could see she was fighting down her embarrassment. "You know, doctor, I do indeed make efforts, but I keep on forgetting to remember myself. It is most humiliating." "The very fact that you observe this fault in your own character is already an improvement," said Dr. Gambit. "We remember ourselves in order to try and create objective observation of personality." "Well, I will go on trying most sincerely to improve, although I do realize I have a dreadfully weak nature. She was, however, looking very pleased. I wonder if she'd made her own blouse, which was a pink with a blue bow at the neck. I always admired people who know how to sew. Carmella was an admirable needlewoman, but it was better not to think about Carmella yet. They were getting up from the table, and I had just time to cram the last morsel of bread in my mouth before I was addressed by the French Marquise. "Claude de Chacarel," she said, extending her hand in a frank and friendly way. If I had known then that she was a marquise, I would have been embarrassed to have my mouth full. However, I didn't know, so I swallowed the bread without choking and said, "Good afternoon," politely. "Let me tell you," she said, taking me firmly by the arm, "how we defeated the German army in Africa back in '41. It was many years ago, but the memory is still vivid." So that was a typical tea-time assembly at Hall. There are a few human activities which are typical for any length of time, however. 3 days passed before I had my first private interview with Dr. Gambit. During that time I began to sort out the identity of my other companions, and even to get to know them a little. Altogether there were 10 of us aged over 70 and under 100. The oldest inhabitant was 98. Her name was Veronica Adams. She had been an artist in her time and still continued to paint watercolours, although she was totally blind. The fact that she couldn't see what she was doing did not prevent her making a large production of work on the coarse toilet paper provided for our use. She could measure a yard a day, and in this manner did not always paint over what she had done the day before. After Veronica in age came Christabel Burns, Georgina Sykes, Natasha Gonzalez, Claude de Churchill, the Marquise I already mentioned, Mauled Wilkins, Vera von Touch, Anna Wurtz. Our daily activity was supervised by Mrs. Gambit, who was lying down most of the time with a sick headache, so we got along on our own. Whenever she appeared, however, the atmosphere became noticeably tense. We were all afraid of her in spite of her constant smile. Apart from Dr. and Mrs. Gambit and 3 servants, nobody apparently lived in the main building. We all occupied our individual huts, or bungalows as they were called. It was several weeks before I learned who lived in the tower of the castle, and by that time I knew everybody and the huts allotted to them. Everybody except the person who lived in the tower. Veronica Adams lived in the boot-shaped hut that had surprised me when I first arrived. Anna Wurtz occupied a Swiss chalet, which, on closer observation, turned out to be a cuckoo clock. Not, of course, a cuckoo clock that really worked, but there was a lead bird looking out of a window under the roof. The window was not a real window. Actually, it was modelled on the wall of the hut and did not look in or out on anything. The Marquise lived in a red toadstool with yellow spots. She had to climb a small ladder to get inside, and this must have been very uncomfortable. Mauled, who I mentioned during the first tea-time assembly, and who actually did make her own clothes, very cleverly, I think, from brown paper patterns, shared living quarters with Vera von Tock in a double bungalow which must have once been a birthday cake. Originally it had been painted pink and white, although these colours had not been able to resist the summer rains. There was a cement candle on the roof with a cement flame, which was difficult to recognise at first because the yellow paint on the candle flame had turned dark green. I sometimes thought the birthday cake hut must have improved with time, and I hoped it would never be repainted with its original colours. Georgina Sykes occupied a circus tent, or rather a cement representation of a tent with red and white stripes. The words "ik, nun, and it, a war" were painted over the door, and for a long time I thought these were some mysterious foreign words. Actually it read, "Walk in and enjoy the show," but time and ivory had overgrown the words. Natasha Gonzalez had an Eskimo's igloo. During fine weather there were plenty of concrete benches to sit on in the garden. Not, of course, that we spent most of our time sitting about. We always had plenty to do, gardening, cooking, and other occupations mostly of a domestic nature. The place I preferred was what we called the bee pond. This was really a stagnant fountain overgrown with water lilies and enclosed with walls prettily covered with white geraniums, rambling roses and jasmine. This secluded spot was the haunt of thousands of honeybees that zimmed in through all the warm days. It's their business. I could sit amongst the bees for hours on end and feel happy, although why they pleased me so I cannot tell. During the morning hours we were busy, although I noticed that Anna Wurtz often lay on her deck chair outside the cuckoo clock, taking the sun. If she was not lying on her deck chair, unique of its kind at Hall, she was standing in the door of somebody's hut talking. This seemed to irritate some people, but personally I became used to it. On the afternoon of the second day, later on I lost count of time, I had a visit from Georgina Sykes. At that time I did not know her name and identified her by her height. She was much taller than anybody else and wore very stylish clothes with a certain jauntish ease I had to admire. That day, I remember, she was dressed in a long kimono and red trousers, Chinese style. This struck me as being very elegant. Her hair was cut in a long bob, and although no longer abundant, were cleverly arranged over a small bald patch to give the impression of a casual page-boy coiffeur. Her eyes must have been large and beautiful before the pendulous mauve flesh had gathered underneath. However, they still had a rather daring expression, accentuated by mascara applied with certain inaccuracies around the eyelids. "There are times when this place gives me the pip," I heard Georgina say after I'd applied my hearing trumpet. "The beastly Gambit female wants me to peel potatoes, and I can't possibly scourge in the kitchen when I have just done my nails." To my surprise, she also wore red nail varnish which covered most of the tops of her large bony fingers. "I thought Mrs. Gambit was a very kindly person," I said. "She smiles so much." "We call her Rachel Rictus," said Georgina, stubbing out a cigarette on my table. "Her name is Rachel, her smile is Rictus. She is a dangerous and horrible creature." "In what way is she dangerous?" My mind went back to the invisible crematorium. I felt anxious again. I wondered if Mrs. Gambit took it upon herself the punishing of the inmates of Lightsome. "She absolutely loathes me because of the doctor. He is a libidinous fellow and stares at me during meals. This makes Rachel Richter squirm with fury. Of course, how can I stop her beastly husband devouring me during meals?" Georgina lit another cigarette with a loud cackle of mirth. "And he's always making excuses to get me into his boudoir for our cosy talks." All this seemed very strange. Dr. Gambit was a middle-aged man and at least 40 years younger than Georgina. However, one never can tell with human nature, and I've had too many surprises in my time not to expect them in the general order of life. "What particular type of medicine is the doctor's speciality?" I asked, in order not to show my surprise, which would not have been polite. "Gambit is a kind of sanctified psychologist," said Georgina. "The result is holy reason like Freudian table-turning, quite frightful and as phony as hell. If one could only get out of this dump, he would cease to be important, being the only male around, you know. It is really too crushingly awful, all these women. The place creeps with ovaries until one wants to scream. We might as well be living in a beehive." Our talk at that moment was interrupted by Mrs. Gambit, who appeared in the doorway carrying a bucket of potatoes. I sincerely hoped she had not been listening to our conversation. "There are at least 2 members of the community missing for the morning task," she said, her hand pressed to her brow, which looked agonized. "It is possible that I might do everything alone while you all sit around and gossip. Everything is possible. Still, for your ultimate advantage, I must not allow the habit of laziness to kill your already slim chances of saving your souls. Or what might become souls with perseverance and work. One can hardly give this dignified title to the fickle emotions most of you use instead of an immortal self." With a pained smile she turned towards the kitchen regions. Georgina stuck out her tongue at the receding back. Nevertheless, we got up and followed her, talking quietly about the weather. "There will be movements at 5 o'clock this afternoon in the workshop," said Mrs. Gambit over her shoulder. "Anybody who's late will forfeit her supper in the usual way." "What are the movements?" I asked Georgina, but she merely made a hideous grimace. Mrs. Gambit heard my question and stopped, setting down the bucket of potatoes. "You'd better hear at once about the movements," she told me. "Anyone who does not understand their significance can never get the full meaning of inner Christianity. The movements were given to us in the past by somebody in the tradition. They have many meanings. I am not at liberty to disclose to you yet, as you have only just arrived, but I can say one of their outer meanings is the harmonious evolution of the whole organism to different special rhythms, which I play to you on the harmonium. Do not expect to grasp the meaning of the movements when you first begin. Just start off as you would any ordinary task of the day. I did not dare ask her if these movements were gymnastics. I felt very worried and only nodded my head several times. I'd meant to nod once, looking at her with what I hoped was an intelligent expression. Somehow my head went on nodding nervously, and I had a job to get it stopped. Georgina nudged me and said something, but I could not hear as I'd forgotten my trumpet in the lighthouse. I began to like Georgina. She seemed so gay. She must have belonged to some fashionable group of people before her family found her too senile to keep at home. She must have had a very exciting and sophisticated life. I hoped she would tell me about it one day, which she did several times over. In the kitchen we all sat around a large scrubbed table, peeling vegetables. Those who were not present must have been occupied with other work outside. Including Mrs. Gambit, there were 5 of us: Georgina, Vera von Tuck, Natasha Gonzalez and myself. Mrs. Van Tuck, whom I never could call by her first name, was very imposing. She was fat, so fat that her face and shoulders were almost the same width. In the midst of all this face were little puckered features, cunning eyes and pursed mouth. Natasha Gonzalez was also on the heavy side, but looked quite small compared to Mrs. Von Tuck. Natasha wore her hair in a bun. Having Indian blood, she had more hair than anybody else, and we envied her. Her face was a pale lemon colour, denoting a bad liver. Her eyes were large like prunes, with heavy lids. Everybody talked and worked at the same time, but as I could not hear them, I dedicated myself to cleaning French beans. French beans in this country are rather coarse and have strings on each side like ropes. We had been working for about an hour when there was a strange incident. Natasha Gonzalez poured all her vegetables and dirty water into my lap and got up with her arms raised and her eyes popping. She stood rigid for at least 2 minutes and collapsed into her chair. Her eyes were now closed and her head sunk on her breast. "She hears voices," yelled Georgina in my ear. "When she does that, she thinks she is getting a stigmata and starts fattening up for Easter." In spite of her fainting condition, I saw Natasha's mouth tighten, as if she heard. Mrs. Van Tuck looked at Georgina angrily and got up to administer wet dishcloths to Natasha's head. Mrs. Gambit said something I could not hear, but looked uninterested. After a while the vegetable peeling was resumed. When the clock struck 12, we went out for a walk around the garden before lunch. I had to change my dress as I was soaking wet, having received a large pan full of water in my lap. I hoped not to catch cold. Anna Wurtz was stretched comfortably in her deck chair and seemed to be talking to herself. That afternoon I arrived in the workshop punctually at 5 o'clock for the movements. There were chairs around the walls, but the room was otherwise bare except for the harmonium. We all sat down in silence till Mrs. Gambit appeared and stood beside the harmonium. I had thoughtfully brought my trumpet so as not to miss anything. I felt very anxious. "This afternoon we are going to begin with primary 0, said Mrs. Gambit, passing a hand across her brow. "We have a newcomer amongst us who has no experience yet of the work. For her benefit I will give a demonstration of primary 0. She paused, looked at the floor for a moment as if collecting herself, then started to rub her stomach in a circular clockwise movement and tapped the top of her head with the other hand. I felt relieved, as I had done this in the nursery and did not have much difficulty repeating Mrs. Gambit's movements. After a moment's demonstration she sat down at the harmonium and applied herself to the instrument with great energy for somebody of such a delicate constitution. Not only did her arms, elbows and shoulders heave, but she actually bounced up and down on her seat as if riding a mechanical horse. We all did the movements, changing hands every 10 rounds on the stomach. It was not too strenuous, but I was pleased when we stopped. Mrs. Gambit twirled around on her seat and addressed me before I got the trumpet to my ear. "Eh? Eh?" I said as she repeated. "Marion Loverby, the first movements are not widdershins. Please match Mauled Wilkins carefully. She is familiar with most of the exercises." We repeated the same thing 4 times, and each time the harmonium got louder. "Now everybody get up and we will run through numbers 4 and 5 bis. Marion Leverby, kindly stand by me and watch the others. You will participate next time." I walked over and stood by her obediently, and they started what was for me impossible to follow. The only thing which was clear was that they stood on one leg like storks and wobbled dangerously. The rest was a series of jerks where arms flew out in all directions and heads twisted and turned till I thought their necks must break. Then a terrible thing happened to me. I started to laugh and could not stop. Tears poured down my face, and I covered my mouth with my hand, hoping they would think I had a secret sorrow and was weeping and not laughing. Mrs. Gambit stopped her exercise on the harmonium. "Mrs. Leverby, if you are unable to control your emotions, kindly leave the room." I left and sat down on the nearest bench, where I laughed and laughed and laughed. Of course this was irreverent behaviour, but there was nothing I could do about it. Even when I was still a young woman, I was occasionally overtaken by spasms of uncontrollable laughter, always in public. Once I remember in a theatre, accompanied by my friend Marlborough, I had to be almost carried out because a man in a frock coat got up to recite some very dramatic poetry. Whether this was a nervous reflex, or the poetry seemed to me really comic, I cannot remember. Marlborough always seemed to be present when I was overtaken by my spasms, which he was pleased to call Marion's maniac laughter. He always enjoyed seeing me make an exhibition of myself. This got me wondering how Marlborough was enjoying Venice. He must be constantly floating about in a gondola, possibly accompanied by his crippled sister. Again I asked myself what could possibly be wrong with this sister that I had never even seen a snapshot of during 30 years' friendship with Marlborough. It must be something quite spectacular, like having 2 heads. In this case he would hardly take her out in gondolas unless perhaps she sat behind a gauze curtain. Thick gauze, or even cheesecloth. Marlborough comes from a rather aristocratic family, so one could expect some kind of peculiarity. Although I had a mad grandmother, and my family were not aristocratic at all, but can cows be aristocrats? 2-headed calves are quite common in fairs. I was thinking all this when I was joined by Mrs. Von Tuck, who sat down ponderously. She was still breathing heavily from the exertion of the movements. "Somebody is singing O Sol Mio to Marlborough, who is floating around in a gondola with his 2-headed sister," I said, and stopped abruptly. Really, I must learn not to say my thoughts aloud. The image had been so clear that I had seen her 2 heads through the lemon cheesecloth curtains of the gondolas. Mrs. Von Tuck ignored what I said and leaned on me in a conspiratorial fashion, so that I had difficulty in adjusting my hearing trumpet. "You must confide your life's tragedy to me," she said, puffing and panting. "We all have our trials and sorrows on the path of life till we see the light." "I've had many difficulties," I replied with the intention of complaining about Muriel and Robert. This would have been highly agreeable, but just as I was beginning about the television set, she interrupted me with an impatient gesture. "Yes, I understand all. There are few dark corners in the human heart that I have not probed with my special insight. I'm not a visionary like Mrs. Gonzalez, Natasha, dear Natasha, but I have astral insight which enables me to help and comfort my fellow creatures. In my own humble way I have turned many erring souls to the light, yet my poor gifts are nothing compared to the wonderful powers of Natasha. She is controlled, you understand. Spiritual control is a rare and beautiful gift. Natasha is the pure vessel through which unseen powers are made manifest to us. Not I, but that which works within me. Those are Natasha's constant words. She is a great limpid humility, like the Master whose miracles were worked with the words, "Not I, but my Father which is in heaven." During the pause, I hastened to get back to Robert and the television set. "My grandson Robert," I said, "has an unpleasant addiction to television. Before he installed this horrible apparatus in the house, I used to sit in the lounge after dinner and keep the whole family amused with fairy tales and anecdotes of my past life. I pride myself that I can tell a very amusing story when I wish. Nothing vulgar, of course, but witty and even spicy when I'm not too troubled with my rheumatism. Rheumatism, of course, is a great hindrance to funny stories. Now, my daughter-in-law, Muriel, is very unsympathetic to rheumatism. She's also very greedy with chocolates, which she always hides. A very unpleasant habit. I often wonder how Galahad would ever manage to marry a person like Muriel." I was beginning to enjoy myself, but Mrs. Von Tuck soon stopped me talking with an imperious gesture. "You should never pride yourself on anything. Even something as trivial as a comic anecdote is a spiritual plague if used as a source of self-love. Humility is the fountain of light. Pride is a disease of the soul. Many people come to me seeking advice and spiritual comfort. When I lay my hands on them to calm their anxiety and fill them with love and light, I always say, 'First be humble. A full cup cannot receive.'" She was almost sitting on top of me. I could hardly breathe, yet I was determined to tell her more about Muriel. "My daughter-in-law started giving bridge parties after Robert brought the television set to the house. At least it would have been bridge in my day. Now they call it canasta party. They actually turned me out of the lounge when people came in to play this ridiculous game. The first evening I refused to leave the room and told 14 parrot stories without forgetting the end of more than 6. I hoped that she would ask me to tell one of these stories, and I just decided to tell her the Yorkshire parrot story when she began again. "Wednesday evenings Natasha gives little groups in our bungalow. I'm sure you would find great spiritual profit if you joined. There would only be Natasha, Mauled, you and myself, all very cosy and intimate. Natasha gives us the messages, sent to each one of us individually from the great unseen, and then we hold hands around a little table and exchange our vibrations. There are times when we are favoured with materializations from the astral plane." I had only got halfway through the parrot story when she heaved herself off the bench and said, "Then we shall expect you at 8:30 on Wednesday evening at my bungalow. Do not mention this to Mrs. Gambit, as she has great spiritual pride and is jealous of Natasha's wonderful powers. Besides, we keep the circle a secret in order to concentrate astral energy." With these mysterious words she lumbered off, leaving me wondering how the Yorkshire parrot story ended. Anna Wurtz suddenly appeared on the path, and I got up and turned towards my bungalow, pretending I had not seen her. But she walked faster than I and soon caught up with me. Anna did not really prevent me from enjoying the evening air, and without my hearing Trumpet, her voice was a distant murmur like a crowd on a far-off football field. Making no attempt to listen, I saw with delight that Venus was out and sparkled over the tree-tops. I longed to tell Anna how I loved this bright planet, but I knew that would be out of the question. She was looking rather cross. Probably she'd been working dreadfully hard again, although I could not imagine what she did that was so exhausting. How delightful it would be to find a few people, or even one person, unconditionally thrilled by what one had to say. I imagined telling an exciting audience parrot stories for hours on end without anyone interrupting or yawning. Or again to explain how very unfair Muir and Robert had always been to me, and how Galahad used to have a strong character which was gradually sapped away by Muriel's nagging. Mere daydreams, one might say, yet there are people who talk a lot and nobody ever dares interrupt them. What can they possibly have to say that is so interesting? Perhaps if one had ghostly visitations like Mrs. Gonzalez, it would be possible to excite interest in other people, especially if one talked to them about themselves. There, I suppose, was the secret. People only like whatever concerns them, and I am no exception to this rule. We all like to be popular, but what a price to pay, always to talk about the other person and never about oneself. It is doubtful if one would get any enjoyment at all, unless of course one was constantly invited to tea with French pastries. Port wine might be served instead of tea if a very interesting person happened to prefer that. Especially if I was that interesting person and I only talked about other people, In that case, perhaps they might consider changing beverages. I saw myself sitting in a warm parlour with scarlet curtains, surrounded by happy, confidential but vague faces. I drank glass after glass of rich Portuguese wine, occasionally washed down with a tiny French eclair. Everybody got happier and happier. They burst into applause as I reached the lighthouse. Anna Wurtz had disappeared. She must have noticed that I had not been paying attention to what she was telling me. Poor Anna! How terrible for her that nobody ever liked listening to her talk. Venus sparkled over the trees, and it was almost supper time. I fancied a nice boiled egg for supper, but one had to eat whatever appeared on the table. Although Dr. Gambit allowed me to abstain from meat, I could not take 2 helpings of vegetables instead, so I sometimes got up hungry from the table. He told us that as one grows older, one needs less food, that overeating killed old people quicker than anything else. I dare say he was right, but we old people get a lot of simple pleasure from eating. I wondered how Dr. Gambit and Mrs. Von Took kept so fat on our frugal meals. I suppose they did some private eating in their rooms, though how Mrs. Von Took managed to get extra food was a mystery. Mrs. Gambit was always watching over the kitchen like a lynx, and the storeroom was kept locked. I decided to discuss all this with Georgina, who seemed genuinely well informed. There was another important question I decided to discuss with Georgina that concerned the portrait of the nun which hung opposite my place at mealtimes. During meals, Dr. Gambit would usually make long discourses on theoretical matters which I did not understand. While the doctor held forth, I had plenty of time to examine the winking nun. My interest increased as time went on. Georgina was cultured and often mentioned famous artists that had been madly in love with her. So pretending my interest was purely artistic, I questioned her about the painting. It might be the Subarlian school, she said, looking uncommonly thoughtful. Probably painted in the late 18th century. Spanish, of course. An Italian could never have done anything so enchantingly sinister. A nun with a leer. Unknown master. Do you suppose she is really winking, or is she blind in one eye? I asked, anxious for Georgina's opinion on a more personal aspect of the lady. She is definitely winking. The baldy old bag is probably peeking at the monastery through a hole in the wall, watching the monks prancing around in their knickers. Georgina had a one-track mind. It is beautiful, she added. I wonder the Gams let it hang among their hideous possessions. Everything in the house ought to have been burnt long ago, apart from the leering abbess. Certainly the painting had a force all of its own, and I was pleased that Georgina was also impressed. She was such a cultured person, almost an aristocrat. Really it was strange how often the leering abbess occupied my thoughts. I even gave her a name, keeping it strictly to myself. I called her Donna Rosalinda Alvarez de la Couver, a nice long name, Spanish style. She was abbess. I imagined of a huge Baroque convent on a lonely and barren mountain in Castile. The convent was called El Convento de Santa Barbara de Tartaros, the bearded patroness of Limbo, said to play with unbaptized children in this nether region. How all these fancies occurred to me I do not know, but they kept me amused, especially during sleepless nights. Old people do not sleep much. Yes, said Georgina, how those Spaniards understood the paintings of black drapery, so much more superbly blackly depressing than anybody else's black. The old lady's habit has the texture of orchid petals and the colour of limbo. It really is a wonderful painting. Her face surrounded by that white starched frill is as luminous as the full moon and just as bewitching. Somehow I felt that Georgina understood the painting of the leering abbess better than I ever could. 3 days after my arrival at Lightsome Hall, I had my first private interview with Dr. Gambit. I was summoned to his study by a small piece of pink memorandum paper bearing this message. Marion Netherby, kindly report to my office at 6 p.m. L. Gambit, Psych. The office, or study as it was called on ordinary occasions, was situated on the ground floor of the main building. It was a small room looking out into a circular balcony, and further on the lawn and cypress trees which skirted the west wing. The room was stuffed to suffocation point with bibelots and heavy furniture. Books, magazines, brass Buddhas and marble Christs, archaeological miscellanea, fountain pens and all kinds of other small accessories occupied every square inch of space. Dr. Gambit sat behind a huge mahogany desk, which was half as large as the room. He looked professional as he told me to sit down. I found a free space with some difficulty. For weeks or even years we do expect results from the work, said Dr. Gambit. We do, however, expect effort. This institute was founded with the intention of introducing people to the work, inner Christianity. We choose our initiates from people already experienced in the sorrows and difficulties of life in 3 dimensions, people in fact already so disappointed with existence that emotional ties would be weakened with time and frustration. This condition is apt to open psychic doors for new truth. He looked at me severely, but I only kept nodding, as I do when I feel nervous. He wrote something in a notebook and then continued. Every member of this community is closely watched and studied in order that they can receive help. No help can be of any avail if there is not collaboration and effort on the part of the individual. Reports in your particular case show the following list of interior impurities: greed, insincerity, egoism, laziness and vanity. At the top of the list, greed, signifying a dominating passion. You cannot overcome so much psychic deformities in a short space of time. You are not alone as victim of your degenerate habits. Everyone has faults. Here we seek to observe these faults and finally dissolve them under the light of objective observation consciousness. The fact that you have been chosen to join this community should give you enough stimulation to face your own vices bravely and seek to diminish their hold over you. I was somewhat confounded by this disclosure, and I might say offended. After mumbling a bit to get my thoughts in order, I said, Dr. Gambit, you are in error if you think that anybody chose me as an initiate for your institution. I was sent here merely because my family wished to put me out of their way without having a murder on their conscience. My daughter-in-law Muriel chose your institution as the only home for senile ladies, which was financially within her and my son Galahad's means. It is extremely doubtful that anybody within these walls had ever so much as heard of me, so how can you possibly insinuate that I was chosen by the institution? There are certain things that you must neither expect nor try to understand at the present, replied the doctor mysteriously. Live your daily tasks with attention and effort. Do not try to interpret higher planes and their mysteries before you can extricate yourself from automatic habit. Vice and habit mean the same thing. As long as we are victims of habit, we are slaves to vice. I advise you to begin by giving up cauliflower. I notice you have an inordinated appetite for this vegetable. Your reigning passion, in fact. Greed. Mrs. Gambit must have seen me steal a small branch of boiled cauliflower during the morning tasks in the kitchen. I must be more careful, I thought, nodding my head. I am happy and encouraged to see that you are already facing your deficient personality, said Dr. Gambit. Personality is a vampire and true self can never emerge as long as personality is dominant. I wanted to say, yes, all that is true enough, but how can you criticize my greed when you are so much fatter than I am? I could only mumble, however, and he seemed to think that I was asking for spiritual advice. Do not be discouraged, he said. Effort is always rewarded when we have renounced recompense. Although greed is deeply rooted in your nature, the fact that you recognize it as a destructive growth will help you to dislodge it, like a dentist extracting a decayed tooth. Surely anyone so fat must at least be as greedy as myself. Or was it glandular? Fat people always say they have glandular trouble, though they always eat more than anyone else, like Muriel constantly stuffing herself with chocolates and never sharing them with anybody. In any case, all this talk about vicious greed no doubt helped the economy of feeding senile old women. The drawers in that colossal desk of his were no doubt full of preserved fruits, sweet biscuits, jujubes and caramels. The top drawer was reserved, I suppose, for perishable foods such as cheese sandwiches and cold roast chicken, so they wouldn't get forgotten under some account book in a bottom drawer. Glandular indeed, I said aloud. Never heard such nonsense. To my surprise, Dr. Gambit looked pleased and replied immediately, "There you have one of the most important practical bases for self-observation. Glands and their function are one of the first proofs of will over matter." "Glands yourself," I replied, but I was so cross that my enunciation must have been worse than usual, and he went right on telling me how to observe my glands. Fat little whippersnapper telling me about my glands. I must have dozed off after this, as the room was very warm. I woke suddenly as the door was thrown violently open. In came Natasha Gonzalez, dressed like an apparition. She wore a long white nightdress, and her abundant iron-grey hair streamed over her shoulders. Her yellow face had 2 purple spots of rage on each cheek, and she pointed at Dr. Gambit like an avenging fury. "If you do not get rid of that woman," she shouted, "I shall leave the Institute tonight." Pretending to be still asleep, I put the trumpet cautiously to my left ear. Mr. Gambit stood up in some agitation and sat Mrs. Gonzalez in the nearest chair on top of a few paper-backed novels. "Be serene, Natasha, and remember your special mission," he said, lighting a cigarette and putting it in her mouth himself. I observed all this out of one eye. I must say Dr. Gambit had a most unexpected attitude to Natasha Gonzalez. "Dear Lady, serenity is the tribute you must pay to the wonderful gifts which flow through you. Serenity, Natasha," he repeated, fixing her with the 2 thick lenses of his spectacles. "Serenity, Natasha, you are serene, perfect, blissfully calm and serene." Mrs. Gonzalez had relaxed a bit and was now happily puffing the cigarette. "You are serene, Natasha, you are quite calm, and you are relaxing gently. Now tell me, what were you going to say when you came in?" "It concerns a message from the great beyond, which was bestowed upon me by a tall, bearded man." Her voice now had the quality of a sleep-talker. She still gripped the chair spasmodically, however, till the knuckles stood out white. "This towering, bearded figure glided into my bedroom and handed me a wreath of white roses, saying, 'You are Natasha. Upon this fount of light I build my teaching. To you I give the roses of heaven. Your odour of sanctity is fragrant like blossoms to the Lord. My name is Peter, which is rock.'" "Tell me all, Natasha. You are serene and calm, blissfully calm and serene," said Dr. Gambit, placing a forefinger on Natasha's forehead. "Then the holy man took my hand, and we were gently wafted upwards, and he stroked my hair, saying, 'Natasha, these holy roses from the kingdom of heaven are the symbol of your work amongst men and women. You are the pure vessel through which the will of the Master is made manifest to his flock. Rejoice, for you are chosen to lead others. Natasha, blessed amongst women.'" "Then," continued Natasha, gripping the chair and opening one eye, "he told me there was a message for Georgina Sykes. He said, 'Tell Georgina Sykes that if she goes on spreading vicious gossip about Dr. Gambit and herself, that her ever-decreasing chances of salvation will be petrified for ever.'" I saw the doctor twitch nervously. "What sort of gossip?" he asked sharply, then modifying his tone to a hypnotic drawl. "What sort of gossip, Natasha? You are blissfully calm and serene. What sort of gossip?" Natasha's voice was anything but blissfully calm and serene as she replied viciously, "You are going to get a nasty surprise about that backbiting, malignant old trollop. Those sagging, baggy eyes of hers are going to ogle once too often." Dr. Gambit made a slight gesture of impatience. "What sort of gossip, Natasha? Reply. You are now relaxed and serene. Reply." She goes around the whole institution telling people that you're trying to seduce her, and even tried to enter the bungalow at night." "Monstrous!" exclaimed Dr. Gambit angrily. "The woman must be mad." "Georgina Sykes is an obscene old woman," said Natasha with unction. "She's a sex maniac and ought not to be allowed to mix with the other members of the community. She warps their minds." "I shall have to talk to her at once," said Gambit in extreme agitation. "This might ruin the reputation of the whole institution." "That is not all," added Natasha. "She insulted me outrageously. Naturally, I hurried to her bungalow to transmit the message with all the purity of mind I have cultivated for my mission. 'Georgina,' I said gently, 'I have a message for you.' She replied very rudely, saying, 'If it's a message from heaven, stuff it up your something or other.' I was shocked and pained, but I maintained my inner radiance, and I admonished her to listen to what could only be for her own good. Then she pushed me out of the place and slammed the door. Still glowing with secret peace, I went about the day's toil joyfully, till I had the misfortune to meet Georgina half an hour ago on the fuchsia walk. She stopped me and hissed like an angry serpent. 'Natasha Gonzalez, you're a lamentable little hypocrite, and if you ever try and relay any more of your beastly messages to me, I shall spit in your face. That is an entire account of the whole affair. It is my duty to open your consciousness to the danger and perfidy of this horrible woman. I will resign from the Institute if she stays on.'" Dr. Gambit seemed to have forgotten about blissful serenity. He was now pacing up and down, wringing his hands, saying, "This is a terrible occurrence. Georgina Sykes is kept here by her nephew, who pays twice as much as anybody else because she takes extras. Morning bovril, clean sheets twice a week, massage and Ovaltine at bedtime. It is most distressing. Mrs. Gambit must be spared all this. Her migraine would prevent me sleeping for weeks." Natasha, who did not seem interested in these reflections, got up to go, saying, "Take my advice and get rid of her. She's a public menace." Finally, I also got up and left. I doubt if the doctor saw me go. He was staring out of the window, looking so distressed that I felt sorry for the poor man. I noticed the doctor always seemed deflated in the presence of Mrs. Gambit, and now I understood that he was actually afraid of her. Possibly she also punished him through the stomach. The person who controls the distribution of food has almost unlimited power in a society such as ours. Mrs. Gambit's despotic rule of the kitchen seemed an unfair advantage. I wondered if it would not be possible to organise a small mutiny. Sunday afternoon was the usual period for receiving visitors. More affectionate relatives would arrive with picnic lunches, which were eaten in different corners of the garden or on the lawn. The rest of us, unfavoured by this special attention, would sit near the lunchers and observe them as closely as possible in order to be able to criticise them later on. Subjects for discussion were always welcome. Also, people receiving sumptuous gifts such as roast chickens and chocolate cake merited close observation. Several Sundays went past before Galahad and Muriel came to see me. They arrived towards 5 o'clock in the afternoon, bringing a box of multicoloured jujubes and a letter from Carmella. I was most excited to get news of Carmella at last, but I controlled my impatience and kept the fat envelope in my pocket in order to delect it alone and unperturbed. Muriel looked fatter than ever, and Galahad, I thought, looked rather tired. "I know you'll be very happy to hear that Robert is engaged to be married," said Muriel, whose voice was always so unpleasantly loud that I was obliged to listen to her. "We are very pleased because he has chosen a nice English girl whose family are very comfortably off. They are an old yeoman family from Devonshire. Colonel Blake was here with Flavia, and the 2 children fell in love at the annual tennis tournament organised by the British Club. We both think it is a most suitable match, don't we, Galahad?" Galahad said something I did not hear, and Georgina walked close by, giving me a prodigious wink. "Poor old creature," yelled Muriel at Georgina's retreating back. "She looks quite dotty. Somebody ought to give her some proper clothes." Georgina turned her head and leered, so I knew she had heard Muriel's remark. I felt ashamed of having such an insensitive daughter-in-law. Besides, pity for Georgina was most displaced, and we all admired her elegant and rather extravagant clothes. So my own baby Robert is a grown-up man now and taken a wife, continued Muriel in the same strident voice. They are to be married in June. Isn't that exciting news? Nothing about Robert excites me, I replied. How are the cats, the red hen, and Rosina and her children? Old Mrs. Velasquez took charge of the cats, and Rosina took the red hen back to her pueblo. We had to get rid of Rosina. She became too impertinent. The house was repainted. That was Robert's idea. He wanted to invite his fiancée to a nice, comfortable home. You would hardly recognise the house now. The living room is dark rose and the kitchen is seascape blue. They sell a new plastic paint which is also washable. Galahad bought some palms to stand in the vestibule, and I repotted them in red lacquered tubs which I picked up bargain price at the American Episcopal jumble sale. Carmella had taken the cats, bless her. That was a relief. I felt less happy about the red hen. Hens in pueblos are very thin if they survive at all. Muriel went on telling me news as loud as she could. During our 15 years cohabitation, she had not talked to me half as much. Colonel Blake is staying over to see Robert and Flavia married. In England he's a keen sportsman and will miss the shooting season. However, he's golfing a lot and playing canasta in the evenings, so he seems to be having a lot of fun. Robert and Flavia are taking up amateur theatricals with the Footlight Company. They're doing an old coward play which ought to be a great success. Flavia has the second most important part in the play. The idea of Robert acting in a play gave me nausea, so I said nothing. Mrs. Birch, went on Muriel, was so upset that Flavia got the part in the play that she made a public scene. Really, that woman has no shame. At her age, acting, she must be 60 at least. The sun had started sinking when they left at last. I felt sorry for Galahad, but the day when I could have helped him was long past. Carmella's letter crackled in my pocket, and I hurried off to read it in peace. It was really delightful to look once more on her delicate handwriting and violet-coloured ink. Dear Marion, she wrote, I hardly know if you will read this letter, even if it ever reaches you. I cannot trust that horrible Muriel to deliver it safely, and even if she does, you may be suffering too much to read letters. I've had some awful nightmares about you in that huge, dreary cement building. Modern-style architecture is always so depressing. Those stark exercise yards full of menacing hounds, those lantern-jawed policewomen making you all tramp around in your grey uniforms. Do they make you sew sacks? I always thought they're such an unprofitable occupation. Tuesday night I dreamt you escaped in a straitjacket and hopped for miles. If you can, smuggle out a short note. I should feel very much relieved, as I'm not sure that they don't give truth serum all the time. The 2 cats are well and happy. I did not arrive in time to save the red hen. Alas, she is almost sure to be eaten soon. The cats felt a little strange at first, but they soon settled down. All cats are psychic, as you know, and they felt my sympathy immediately. Apart from the nightmares I've had about you, I've been having recurrent dreams about a nun in a tower. She has a most interesting face, which is slightly deformed by a perpetual wink. I cannot imagine who she is. One of my correspondents, perhaps. I'm thinking of organising a visit to you, although if we have to talk through bars under the eye of a policewoman, I shall not be able to bring you chocolate cake and a bottle of port as I wished. If possible, let me know the exact measurements between each bar, and I will be able to calculate what would fit through. Cigarettes are always a comfort, and even the narrow space would be wide enough to pass cigarettes. Should I bring marijuana cigarettes to alleviate your misery? Arabs, I am told, sell this herb behind the San Fandela market. In order to buy it, I would have to go armed, as it is a very dangerous and tough part of the city. Naturally, I would go to any lengths to lessen your suffering. However, it would be very difficult to obtain marijuana in any quantity, so please be precise in your letter if you really need it. Planning my visit to you has been most absorbing, as I have different disguises for each visit, so that they do not get suspicious in case I have to help you to escape. Alicia, the new maid, tells me her grandfather has an old Charo costume, which was left to him by his late employer, and he would be willing to hire it out for a small sum. I'd rather hope to arrive dressed as a Hungarian general, but this is rather a rare uniform in these parts. A Toreador costume would also be colourful, but I think this might turn out too expensive. In any case, I ought not to be too elaborate, as that might arouse their suspicions. A large false moustache and dark glasses are usually enough to change one's appearance considerably. Of course, it would be much more convenient if we could communicate by means of underground passages. With this end in view, I made some plans based on termite engineering, as I do not suppose we would be able to obtain machinery. I enclose the plans in this letter. Please take care that they do not fall into the hands of the authorities. The consequences might be disastrous for us both. Brainwashing, they say, is the latest method of torture. Thumbscrews went out of fashion long ago. In case you have not heard of brainwashing, this is a form of mental torture provoked by constant anxiety inflicted by others. It soon drives you mad, so be careful to take no notice if they say you are to face the shooting squad. Refuse any injections, even if they say that they are vitamins. It might be truth serum. This is the part of the brainwashing which makes you swear you have done a lot of things you never even thought of doing. I keep dreaming that I am dead and have to bury my own corpse. This is most unpleasant, as the corpse has begun to go bad and I don't know where to put it. Last night I had the same dream, the winking nun, and then the odious duty of interring my own corpse. I've decided to have it embalmed and sent here to my house, cash on delivery, but as soon as the funeral agency arrived here, I was so alarmed at having to face my dead body that I sent it back again to the funeral parlour without paying. What a relief it is that we don't really have to undertake the worry and trouble of our own burials. Do study the enclosed plans carefully and reply by return of post. I enclose 2 pesetas that you could use to bribe somebody to smuggle the letter out of the institution. I would also need the drawing of the entire layout, which you could do in secret. You draw it as if you were hovering above in a helicopter, not as an ordinary watercolour. Wouldn't it be wonderful if I won a helicopter in a crossword puzzle competition? There is not much hope, though, I'm afraid, as they never give such practical prizes. Do not give up hope entirely in spite of the horror of your situation. I am mobilising all my mental capacities to obtain your unconditional freedom. Ever most affectionately, Carmella. Having read Carmella's letter over several times, I sat plunged in thought. The winking nun could be no other than Donna Rosalinda Alvarez Cruz de la Cuva. How very mysterious that Carmella should have seen her telepathically. How excited she would be when I told her about the oil painting and how the abbess occupied my thoughts. Carmella's plans for the underground passage between the institution and her house seemed very difficult to realise in actual fact. Who would do all the digging? Where would we find dynamite to explode our way through underground rocks? And with pickaxes, it would take Carmella and I forever to burrow at least 10 kilometres underground. Nevertheless, I decided I would make a careful plan of the institution and send it to Carmella as soon as possible. I had not heard of anybody having any difficulty sending off correspondence, and a lot of ladies received uncensored letters, so it would not be necessary to smuggle out the letter as Carmella suggested. This made everything easier. How kind of Carmella to take charge of my dear cats at her own expense. How I longed to see her again and suck violet-flavoured lozenges on the porch. It was Sunday, so supper was rather more informal than usual. Cold roast beef and potato salad were placed on the table and not passed around. Junket and buns were taken with coffee in the lounge. We did our own washing up in relays, as the maids were out that day. An hour of quiet recreation was allowed after this meal. Some of us talked, knitted, or played simple games. The Marquise, Claude, La Châterelle, and Mauled always played snakes and ladders after supper. It was a ritual which I liked to watch. The Marquise always moved her square with military strategy, giving us lurid accounts of battles she had fought and won all over Europe and Africa. Mauled, who was timid, hardly ever dared interrupt these repetitive wartime souvenirs. The mud was up to our necks, the Marquise would say, tossing the dice on the board. The captain and I had bullets whizzing through our caps as we peeped over the trenches. The Germans were pressing forward mercilessly with their heavy artillery. Tanks chattered their machine guns like avenging robots. The situation was desperate. We were mortally tired, yet duty kept us staggering at our posts. The only hope is direct attack, mon capitaine. We are under fire on both flanks. The captain's strong jaw tightened perceptibly. It would be cold-blooded murder for the troops, he replied, looking through his mud-caked face with sharp blue eyes. I gripped his arm and pointed at the sea behind us. Where shall we retreat? I said, my voice husky with emotion. Should we not rather die fighting than be squashed into the mud by the tanks? As usual, I must bow to your advice, said the captain. En avant! And that's how the Battle of Ypres turned out in our favour, continued the Marquise modestly. Most of us were wiped out, some of us drowned trying to swim the channel to Dover. Our little battalion forced the German tanks to retreat after 24 hours of constant fire. At that moment Mauled threw a 6, and her square climbed up a ladder almost to victory. The Marquise swore under her breath and threw a 2 which got her nowhere. I am never lucky on Sunday, she said. I was born on a Tuesday, if one could consider that lucky, but I do not complain, for my life has been full of excitement and pleasure. For instance, I remember how we escaped the German snipers in North Africa. It was a forced march through barren, mountainous country. I was second in command of our battalion. We were escorting 2 Red Cross ambulances to the desert. I'm afraid I've won, said Mauled timidly. Pure luck, of course. This game requires no real skill like chess. So you have, said the Marquise, peering closely at the snakes and ladders. Well, I believe a sporting instinct is more important than always winning, so let me congratulate you warmly. Of course, I might have won if it had not been Sunday. Mrs. Gambit rang a small bell. We all rose to retire to our respective villas. I was thankful that I lived in a lookout and not in a cement toadstool like the Marquise, although she never complained about climbing up a ladder every time she wanted to get into bed. It must have reminded her of the happy days when she was climbing in and out of shell holes. The moon was almost full and lighted our way through the garden. I walked with Mauled back to the double bungalow she occupied with Mrs. Von Took. Moonlight always makes me think of Switzerland, said Mauled sadly. As a girl I used to go to Mürren for the winter sports. I never was much good at skiing, although I could skate a bit. Not figure skating or anything fancy, just ordinary getting along. Yes, indeed, I replied. There is nothing I love so much as snow lit by moonlight. For years I've wanted to go to Lapland, just to be able to sail along in a sledge drawn by those white woolly dogs and admire the snow. Further north they use reindeer, which also give milk. I suppose they make cheese too, although I fancy it might have a rather goaty taste, which never appealed to me. We really must not allow ourselves to become victims to daydreaming, said Mauled. Dr. Gambit says daydreaming saps more energy than riding a bicycle. I am sure he must be right, although I am not clever enough to understand the reasons for all he tells us. Still, at our age, it is difficult not to indulge a little in small pleasures. Although I know you will think I am silly, I sometimes find myself imagining that I am strolling through a whispering birch forest somewhere in the north. It is early spring, and the last frosts make the grass crackle under my feet. Yes, I know, I said fervently. Birch trees, silver birch, that seems so much more alive than those nasty palm trees. It is so vivid, went on Mauled, that it makes up a whole story. Would you mind very much if I told you about it? I would enjoy hearing about it very much, I replied, hoping it would not take too long, as I wanted to begin a letter to Carmella before it got too late. Mrs. Gambit insisted that all lights be extinguished by 11 o'clock. Well, said Mauled, there I am, dressed in tweed trousers and leather jacket and strong brock shoes. I'm strolling alone, whistling, or rather humming. I cannot whistle since I lost my teeth. The birch forest is full of babbling brooks which I cross on smooth stepping stones. These are sometimes rather slippery, and I have to steady myself with a stout bramble walking stick I always carry. Such clear, frolicking little brooks. They seem to promise all kinds of innocent fun. A light wind rustles the leaves of the birch trees. The air is fresh and cool. As I stroll along, I become aware that I have a purpose, and soon, with a thrill of joy, I know what it is. I must find a magic cup hidden somewhere in the wood. Then I come up a marble statue of Diana and her dogs. She is half covered with moss and strides perpetually through the forest. The cup lies at the foot of the statue. It is a silver chalice brimming over with golden honey. I sip the honey and return the cup to Diana with a thankful prayer. Or rather, it's not quite like that. I make an attempt to sip the honey, but it is too thick, and I have to look around for a spoon. There are no spoons, so after licking the rim of the chalice, I return it still nearly full of honey to the goddess, and then I say my prayer of thanks. The statue of Diana is not far behind, and I find a small iron key lying half hidden under a stone. I know I shall need this, so I put it in my pocket. Sure enough, I suddenly find myself in front of a wooden door embedded in a mossy wall. Just as I am wondering if I ought to open it or not, and I am trying the iron key in the lock, somebody creeps up behind me and roughly pushes me through the door. The door opens of its own accord, and I fall into a strange, luxurious bedroom furnished in a style which seems Renaissance. But I am so ignorant about art that it might easily be Gothic or even Baroque. The four-poster bed is occupied by a woman wearing a frilly white nightcap. She's winking at me, and I recognise her as the nun in the oil painting that hangs in the dining room. Very strange indeed, I said. That painting has occupied my thoughts since I first saw it. Who is the nun? Nobody seems to know, said Mauled, or rather they pretend they do not know, although I often think that Christabel Burns could tell a lot if she wished. She is such a secretive person, though, and never talks much to anybody. Perhaps she feels different being a negress, I said. Negresses have different sorts of souvenirs from us. I often wanted to talk to her, but she always seems so busy. Well, I suppose I ought to hurry to bed, said Mauled. I share a bungalow with Mrs. Von Tock. You know Vera? She doesn't like me to go to bed late, as she says she can hear me taking my shoes off through the walls. She's a very light sleeper, and I do appreciate Vera so much. She's very spiritual. I could never reach her higher plane, I'm afraid. Yes, she tells me you have séances on Wednesday evenings. Mauled looked a little surprised. She told you, she said. That means she must think you have possibilities of initiation. I do hope you will join us on Wednesday. Thank you, I replied. I would be very happy. I thought perhaps they served light refreshments, possibly liqueurs. Somebody had told me that Mrs. Von Tock had private means. Something must have kept her fat. What about Natasha Gonzalez? I asked. They say she has supernatural powers. There was a slight hesitation before Mauled replied. Yes, she is a very spiritual person too. She has visions. Good night. I really must go before Vera gets into bed. She left me wondering why she looked so fearful when I mentioned Natasha Gonzalez. The moon floated high in the heavens. I began to compose my letter to Carmella. It really was a pity that she was not present to enjoy so much mystery. I thought of suggesting that she should come for a weekend, providing I could obtain permission from Mrs. Gambit. Carmella would have some very interesting theories about all these people. Before retiring into the lookout, I stood outside admiring the moon and stars and listening to the night creatures through my trumpet. Anna Wurtz was talking to herself in the distance. A cricket chirped and a nightingale sung nearby. Now where, I wondered, had I put my pen and ink? The paper, I knew, was in the closet upstairs. When I had written Carmella all the news I could think of, I went to bed, leaving the rest for another day. The moon shone in through my window, and I could not get off to sleep, but lay half dreaming and half awake, a state which is quite familiar to me now. Souvenirs from the far past rose like bubbles in my mind, and things I thought were long forgotten came back so clear, as if they had just happened. The Luxembourg Gardens and the smell of chestnut trees, Paris, Saint-Germain-des-Prés, having breakfast on the terrace of a cafe with Simon, whose face was as clear and solid as if still full of life. But Simon must be dead for 30 years now. There is nothing left of him as far as I know. Simon talking like the Arabian Nights, love and magic. Then I dreamt that I was preparing lunch in a summer house in the hollow of a large garden with Simon. There was something important I had to ask him, and I touched his chest. But you are as solid as I am, I told him. Oh, Simon, why did you die before you could tell me what it was all about? Simon, what is it like being dead? That was what I had to ask him, and I felt embarrassed. He looked puzzled for a moment, then he said, You think it is going to end all the time, but it never does. He had beautiful eyes like a Siamese cat. Simon lost in interminable twilight gardens, never getting free. But he knew so much. Simon, perhaps I would still be in Paris. Oh, the joy if I could just walk along the quays and admire the books, or look at the sign from the Pont Neuf. I would walk up Rue Saint-André-des-Arts to the market and buy red wine and brie for lunch. That would be plenty for my frugal needs. Pierre, Rue des Beaux-Arts. Clever Pierre with all his wonderful theories coming to such a sad end. He was drowned in his bath, murdered, they say, by a still-life painter. Pierre had flown into a rage because he recognised a carrot in one of the paintings of the murderer, Jean Plessard. The outraged artist had crept into Pierre's apartment and, finding him in the bath, held him under water till he expired. Poor Pierre! I forget if his murderer was sent to the guillotine. Pierre, who was so wonderfully clever and sensitive about painting that if a canvas had anything but one colour painted on the same colour, he would almost faint with horror. Form, he said, was outdated and vulgar. Therefore the carrot, which may not have been a carrot at all, sent him to an untimely death.